Hey guys, this is Neon. Welcome back to Clownfish TV, and today we are going to talk about Patreon. Patreon, the crowdfunding platform that many YouTubers, many artists, writers, content creators use, is questionable in my opinion. We're going to do a video talking about why I personally think if you are a content creator or an artist or whatever, and you're using Patreon to help fund your ventures, you might want to consider moving off of the platform. I think Patreon is headed for an implosion pretty soon. So let's talk a little bit about what has led me to believe that Patreon is headed for an implosion. Now, those of you who follow all of the YouTube drama, who follow this sort of thing on YouTube or Twitter, might realize that Sargon, who is a popular and controversial YouTuber, had his Patreon account banned. He had it banned. And Patreon initially did not give him any indication as to why his account was banned. Now, Sargon, as I understand it, was making over $10,000 a month on Patreon. It was his primary funding source, I believe. And Patreon pulled the plug on Sargon, not because he violated Patreon's terms of service per se on the platform itself, but because of things he said elsewhere on the internet that, in my opinion, were taken out of context. Now, before I get into this, I want to put a bit of a disclaimer here. I do not watch Sargon. I am only somewhat familiar with his content. Given the familiarity with his content that I do have, I probably will disagree with him about a good many things. However, I find it very disconcerting that Patreon will basically follow you around the internet and spy on you to make sure that you're behaving the way they think you should behave and saying the things that they think you should say. And if you violate their moral code somewhere on the internet, for whatever reason, they can just pull the plug on your account and not give you an explanation. Just, you can be making $10,000 one day, and the next thing you know, your account is gone. There's no warning. You know, at least with YouTube. Now, YouTube has banned accounts before too, but at least YouTube will give you some kind of warning. You know, hey, copyright infringement, you know, 2-3 strikes, you're out. You know, there have been complaints, etc., etc. You know, so YouTube tends to give more of a warning. Now, I have heard cases where they really haven't. They've just pulled the plug on people. But this whole situation shines a bright light on why I think putting all your eggs into a basket with a defective handle is a bad idea. And I believe Patreon has a defective handle. So here we go. This is coming from the Post Millennial, which is a Canadian publication. Now, before you go like, oh, they're biased, I actually went out and checked the Post Millennial on Media Bias Fact Check. Factual reporting is high, and a factual search reveals they have not failed a fact check. They've never failed a fact check. So I'm gonna kind of trust them here. Patreon betrays the trust of its users. Patreon created such an atmosphere of distrust that many users have set up accounts with a competing platform. There was unified outrage this week after a few high-profile accounts were removed from the crowdfunding site Patreon. Carl Benjamin, who goes by the online name Sargon of Akkad, was one of the people who woke up Friday morning to find his income had been cut off. Benjamin had received no warnings about his account and actually found out from his subscribers that his Patreon page had been deleted. This was not the first time Patreon landed themselves in the center of a similar controversy. In June 2017, they removed conservative pundit Lauren Southern from their platform after she was seen on video helping block refugee boats in Europe. Though others may not have approved of Southern's actions, censorship causes concern, and every time a large channel is deleted, there's an outcry of supporters that will affect other users. Subscribers will cancel their pledges and delete their accounts to protest censorship. The vast majority of deleted or banned channels that are deemed to be politically incorrect or anti-social justice voices. This is true. I mean, you start to look at who is actually being banned from these platforms. Now, again, you know, to reiterate, I identify as a leftist. I think I consider myself center-left or a moderate liberal. However, I am noticing the ongoing theme here with the people who are being banned is that they tend to lean conservative, or they have very like quote unquote anti-SJW voices. So ironically, the canceled subscriptions from those who protest primarily affect other similar channels. The protest amplifies the silencing of the viewpoint they wish to support. Now, there is support for Sargon from, a bunch of conservative voices. Naturally, on the internet, they talk about this. So, this is coming from the post-millennial. Patreon did respond. They responded via a Medium post, which is very telling because Medium is basically Tumblr 2.0. Now, bear with me here as I go through this a little bit, and I'll tell you exactly what happened to Sargon and why it affects you, why it affects the average, maybe the average cartoonist or average animator, average content creator on Patreon, and why I think Patreon is a very dangerous place for you to be right now. This is from Jacqueline Hart, who works for Patreon. I think she's like their media manager or PR person. So she puts this post out here yesterday. It was yesterday. Hate speech on Patreon. Some creators and patrons have questions regarding our removal of Sargon of Akkad for hate speech. We take a strong stance against hate speech and want to make sure everyone has the full context regarding this removal. Before getting into the specifics, I'd like to warn you that there is some inflammatory language. Well, actually, they bleeped a lot of it out. In an interview, okay, this is very important. In an interview on another creator's YouTube channel, Sargon said, here's the thing, this didn't even take place on Patreon. Sargon's infraction took place on not his own YouTube channel, but another creator's YouTube channel, and on YouTube, not Patreon itself. So YouTube, apparently that video is still up. YouTube has not deemed it problematic, but Patreon has deemed it problematic. And because of something Sargon said, which I believe, looking into it, was like 10 or 12 months ago, something Sargon said in the past, and it was completely taken out of context, has basically led them to just flip the switch, turn off his Patreon funding without any kind of a warning or explanation until he pressed. So this is what he said in this live stream on this other person's channel. I just can't be bothered with people who chose to treat me like this. It's really annoying. Like you're acting like a bunch of N-words. Just so you know, you act like white N-words. Exactly how you describe black folks acting is the impression I get when dealing with the alt-right. So Sargon, who is being accused of being alt-right himself, Sargon was actually speaking out against the alt-right. Does that mean Patreon supports the alt-right? I'm confused. No, actually, it was poor. It was a poor choice of wording given today's political climate, but he was trying to throw the wording back in the faces of these folks, the actual alt-right. And, again, this was 10 months ago in a YouTube video that is still live YouTube. As of my recording this, I believe the video is still out there. YouTube has not found it to be problematic. He says, look, you carry on, but don't expect me to have a debate with one of your F-words. Like, why would I bother? Maybe you're just acting like an N-word. Have you considered that? Do you think white people act like this? White people are meant to be polite and respectful, and you guys can't even act like white people. Sargon, I don't know if I would have gone there, but it's really amazing to me. I think he was trying to give it back to, I believe he had some alt-right trolls, actual alt-right trolls. Again, I don't condone the wording, but what I find troubling about this situation is that this was on YouTube, not Patreon. It was on YouTube, and it wasn't even Sargon's channel, and it was many months ago. So apparently, Patreon will follow you around the internet to see if you are behaving. Now, there was something like this said on another video I watched where Patreon, when they decide as to whether or not to allow a person on a platform, they basically look at the totality of their behavior. I forget their exact wording on it, but they look at the personality, and if you are what they consider to be a problematic personality, they will just ban your account for whatever nebulous reason they have, which you know, again, I find this very troubling, because what if the line in the sand moves? What if they move the goalpost? You know, what if they don't tell you what they're going to find problematic this year, this month? You know, what if you're fine now and you build up a huge following on Patreon, and next year they decide that, you know, whatever your content is, it's just not in vogue and they don't want to support it, and then they just flip the switch and there goes your income. So some people are worrying that we're reviewing content not posted on Patreon. Yes, you are. You are. You've just admitted that you are. As a funding platform, we don't host much content, but we help fund creations across the internet. As a result, we review creations posted on other platforms that are funded through Patreon. Sargon is well known for his collaborations with other creators, and so we apply our community guidelines to those collaborations, including this interview. So basically, anywhere you don't like Sargon, so anywhere Sargon goes, Sargon is being monitored by Patreon to see if he is worthy of being on the platform. Does anybody else find this troubling? I mean, again, just to reiterate, I don't agree with Sargon's choice of words, okay? But I find it highly, highly troubling that Patreon will basically follow you around the internet if you're well known enough. They will follow you around the internet and look for a reason to lynch you, to lull you into a false sense of security, and then flip the switch and turn off your income. How can you trust a platform like that? It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're as big as Sargon or you're just some random person making comics on the internet. You might have a few $100s a month coming your way that you depend on. You've cultivated an audience. You've sent your audience to Patreon, because Patreon is not a two-way street. You basically are trusting Patreon with your user base. You have to send your users to Patreon, and you're hoping that Patreon takes care of you and your users. This is not taking care of you and your users, and this is really, really nebulous, dubious. It's crap. It's crap. In our community guidelines, we state that we don't allow hate speech. Okay, that's great. He didn't do it on Patreon. I don't think was that video posted on Patreon? I don't know. Part of how we define hate speech in those policies is hate speech includes serious attacks or even negative generalizations of people based on their race and sexual orientation. When reviewing an account for a potential hate speech violation, we consider some of the following questions. Is the creator using racial slurs or negative depictions of a protected class? Now, I watched a video on this whole situation last night, and apparently there are posts on Patreon using harsher language than this on Patreon's platform itself in the text of posts by other creators, but they have not been singled out because, frankly, they're not as big as Sargon. So they have a hate on for Sargon, probably because of his size, his influence. In this case, Sargon used racial slurs to insult others. The alt-right, he used racial slurs to insult the alt-right, which you accuse him of being, and specifically linked those slurs with negative generalizations of behavior in contrast to how people of other races act. He also used a slur related to sexual orientation to generally insult others. Taken in whole with all that context, this violates our community guidelines. Wow. Okay, we understand some people don't believe the concept of hate speech and don't agree with Patreon removing creators on the grounds of violating our community guidelines for using hate speech. It didn't happen on Patreon. I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time with this. Again, I do not condone what he said. Those are words I would never use. But the fact that you are following people around the internet to monitor what they are saying to make sure it agrees with what you believe is and is not acceptable is troubling. Because even if you can take a case like Sargon, or before Sargon, like Alex Jones or whatever, the line is going to be moved to a point where it is going to affect your average everyday Patreon user. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is going to affect Patreon users after I get done with this. We have a different view. Patreon does not and will not condone hate speech in any of its forms. We stand by our policies against hate speech. We believe it's essential for Patreon to have strong policies against hate speech and build a safe community for our creators and their patrons. Now let's go to the responses here on Median. This one's got almost 2,000 claps, more than Patreon's had. What are you talking about with all the context? With all of the context, including listening to Sargon's tone of voice in the entire discussion in the interview, he's using their own warped racist views against them. The alt-right believe white people are superior. Sargon was using their own disgusting views to prove them wrong. He was being sarcastic. Again, Sargon was talking to white supremacists, telling them how they were acting exactly like the people they claimed to hate. You are being clearly disingenuous. Why did you just so happen to leave this fact out of your story? You, Jacqueline Hart, are a liar. You clearly are being dishonest. Thank you for showing the rest of us. And it goes on and on and on. This is where I am. I don't agree with Sargon's tactics, language, or behavior. Neither do I. Maybe he should have been banned for other behavior, but put into context like this, it makes Patreon look even worse. I agree. With the full context, it's obvious to any objective person that Sargon is highlighting the hypocrisy of racists, highlighting the hypocrisy of becoming somewhat of a meme these days because it's so prevalent. There's a whole subreddit dedicated to the topic called Behold the Master Race, blah, 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 white supremacists, blah, blah, blah. Sargon himself is not saying black people act like N-word. His point is that white supremacists are acting like they wrongly think black people act. So he says Sam Harris is right to leave the platform. Your income isn't stable with this platform. I agree 145%, because that's more than 100%. When it's subject to the highly relativist and arbitrary view of the trust and safety team. Yeah, I agree with this. I think Patreon is an unsafe platform. And he talks about Sam Harris. Now, several prominent folks who use Patreon are jumping ship, or they're talking about jumping ship, and it's not just quote-unquote alt-right people or the dark web, or however they're trying to spin it. It's actually, this is going to have a huge domino effect on Patreon. And it needs to, because the platform is not stable. So atheist podcaster Sam Harris says he's done with Patreon because of deplatforming. He's actually one of their top, I believe he's like in the top 10 or top 15 on Patreon. Now, the way Patreon works is it's definitely an 80-20 rule or a 90-10 rule, where 10 to 20% of the Patreon accounts probably bankroll the majority of the site. I mean, you have a lot of cartoonists that maybe have a couple dozen backers, but it's the guys who have and girls. It's the guys and girls who have, thousands and thousands of Patreon backers that have driven their audience to Patreon, that have made Patreon what it is, that are, bankrolling the site, and they're going to leave. Several major Patreon creators are going to leave Patreon. And you know what? Good, because I think this is completely uncalled for. So there is talk about people doing an alternative to Patreon, and it's funny because people are like, well, Patreon is kind of a big deal. How are they going to compete with them? Actually, let's go here. Yeah, Jordan Peterson claims he's building an alternative to Patreon. You don't think these guys with their following and their connections in the tech business, like, look, you got to Twitter, Notch, the creator of Minecraft, Notch, who has infinite money, has spoken out against Patreon. I've decided to stop giving Patreon my money. Sorry if this affects you. I will do my best to keep supporting you in other ways. You don't think Notch could reach into the couch cushions and bankroll a viable option to Patreon? Now, there was supposed to be an option to Patreon called Subscribestar, and I don't know much about Subscribestar, but apparently Subscribestar came under attack because a lot of the folks who were banned from Patreon went to Subscribestar, and then Subscribestar was attacked on the PayPal level. I guess PayPal stopped taking transactions from Subscribestar. We don't know what exactly was going on there. Geeky has speculated it might be industrial espionage. Maybe Patreon decided that they were going to try to shut down a potential competitor. But I think Patreon is going to shut itself down. Again, Business Insider even is covering this. Crowdfunding platform Patreon defends itself from protest by the intellectual dark web. Publishes slur-filled post from banned YouTuber. Did they publish a slur-filled post from the banned YouTuber? I don't know, but you scroll down here. This is a Business Insider, and they actually, if you scroll down, and it's buried in here. Notably, the conversation was not on Patreon's own platform. I thought they published a slur-filled a slur-filled post from the banned YouTuber. And he actually hasn't been banned from YouTube. He's banned from Patreon. So that's a very misleading headline there, Business Insider. But they even admit, notably, the conversation was not on Patreon's own platform. In its blog post, Patreon explained, as a funding platform, we don't host much content, but we help fund creations. Yada, yada. I already read that. So they do admit in the fine print that this did go down, but they're being very, this is an untrue headline. So, what we're seeing here, is, another gatekeeper. We're seeing another gatekeeper. Patreon was originally, I thought Patreon was set up to allow creators to better monetize their following so they could create independent content. That was, as I believe, or did believe, the purpose of Patreon, at least when I first started using it 4 or 5 years ago when it first launched. And it was great for cartoonists. It was great for webcomics creators, especially that you could have a better way to fund your comics. And but now Patreon has set itself up as another gatekeeper. You're allowed to use the platform as long as they agree with everything you say, as long as you behave yourself, because they're going to follow you around the internet and make sure you behave yourself. I think that 99.9% of people are probably safe from a purge. Again, you're looking at the people they target, and they're large, large and loud. Let's put it that way. They're large and loud. But again, I am concerned about the line being moved, and I don't think that anyone, should use a platform that can do this, that can ban you, arbitrarily based on your behavior outside of their platform. Clearly, Patreon is a gatekeeper now. They're not just a service to handle transactions. And the thing is we're seeing more and more of this. So, okay, so you go to Kickstarter, and Kickstarter hired a person earlier in the year who apparently her job is to vet comics projects. And now you say, well, that's not going to affect me. And it probably won't. Most people probably will not be affected by the vetting process, but there have been instances, with conservative comics creators. They tried to push their projects through Kickstarter, and they were declined, not because of the project itself, like there was nothing actually wrong with the content of the project, but because they did not like the creator of the project. And again, we're seeing these companies that were originally supposed to have the creator's best interest in mind, to be a way to sidestep mainstream media and do your own thing. We're seeing them become gatekeepers now. They've basically become everything they were supposedly against at the beginning. So Kickstarter and Patreon, I would just say, be very careful. Don't put all your eggs to any one basket. And I think that is true of any platform, even YouTube. We've seen the Twitter purge. You look at YouTube, and again, for right now, they are extreme cases. And 99% of people are not going to be affected. But when you get away with it once, you can keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And eventually, any creator who says anything that might go against whatever the feeling is that current year, is in danger of losing a platform on YouTube or on Twitter or on Patreon or on Kickstarter. And when you're dealing, especially with Patreon and Kickstarter, you're talking about money, like actual money, livelihoods. And I cannot recommend to young artists, young creators, young content creators, writers, whatever it is that you do, I can't recommend Patreon anymore, because this is really, really dubious. And, we didn't do a whole lot on Patreon. We did start a Patreon a couple months ago. We pulled the plug on it. And we're leaving. We're going to try to do something else. Really, Patreon doesn't do anything that you can't do yourself. I mean, really all Patreon did was copy the subscription model, which a lot of webcomics people actually put in place 10, 15 years before Patreon. They were taking like PayPal subscriptions, or they were doing site subscriptions. And Patreon kind of stole that, co-opted that idea from webcomics people who were doing it years and years before, that they were actually giving bonus content for people who were tipping them every month. You know, so it's nothing new. There's nothing Patreon does that you can't do yourself on your own website. And I think now more than ever, especially for content creators, it's become very, very apparent that you are going to have to host as much of your own content as possible, if for no other reason than to have a backup. Okay, because at some point, I mean, believe it or not, it's hard to imagine now, but YouTube might even shut down at some point. YouTube might decide that they're not going to monetize anymore because the advertisers pulled out. I mean, anything could happen. You look at what happened with Tumblr. You look at what happened with Tumblr, where people were just kind of cruising along, doing their thing, and then Tumblr got a hair up its ass and started banning accounts that weren't even not safe for work because they were purging the site. Now, as of yesterday, you're not allowed to post anything that might be not safe for work. There were artists whose entire livelihoods depended on their Tumblr presence. And that is probably the biggest mistake any creator can make, is depending too heavily on social media. Social media is great to promote yourself, to get yourself out there in front of people that you normally wouldn't be in front of. But the problem is that you are subject to the whims of these terms of service that could change at any point in time. The companies have no obligation to host your content for whatever reason. They could go out of business tomorrow. We've seen companies like Drama Fever, and now granted they don't take user-submitted content. Drama Fever just shut down one day. They just shut down one day, and Tumblr effectively just shot itself in the foot. And I believe Patreon is next. I really do. I think Patreon is not going to bounce back from this. This is not the first time that Patreon has fucked up big time. Last year, at about the same time, Patreon tried to gouge backers, make backers eat the fees with a new payment structure. Now, they did backpedal a couple of days later, and they said, we're sorry, it didn't go over well, we're not going to do that. Again, this was about the same time of year last year, and they backpedaled. The thing is even if Patreon would come back, now and say, yeah, you know what, banning Sargon like that wasn't a very good idea. We promise we're not going to do that again. They promised before. They promised on, I guess, Jack Conte was on a YouTube show, and he promised that, they would never arbitrarily just pull funding on people like this. And you know what? They did it. They did it. So, this is really dubious. I don't think Patreon can be trusted anymore. And I recommend to you, if you are an artist and you're watching this video, start building your own website. Start building your own website and find a way to monetize your users more directly, because there's no guarantee that Patreon is going to be around for much. There's no guarantee Kickstarter even is going to be around, but make sure that you have a place that you own that you can use as your primary hub. And you can do social media. You can use social media. Absolutely do it. It's a great tool. But at the end of the day, make sure that you're still driving people to your website, because any of these services could go belly up tomorrow. They could change their terms of services tomorrow. They could take your money away tomorrow. So make sure you own your own stuff. Speaking of which, going into 2019, if you go to clownfishtv.com, there's really nothing there right now. We're actually building a new website. If you're looking to support the YouTube channel, please subscribe to the... we're going to send out an email when we launch the new site. We are going to have ways to support Clownfish TV more directly without using Patreon or anything like that. And we're working on some ideas right now, but we want to, keep making content. We want to keep making stuff, and we just don't think that these platforms are ideal anymore. We do not want to put our eggs into a basket that we think has a defective handle. And I think Patreon for sure has problems, and I don't expect it to be around much longer. I think too many people are going to pull out. I think they're going to take their money with them. I think that, backer trust has been violated at this point. A lot of smaller people are looking at what's going on, and they're going to pull out, and it's going to be a trickle-down effect. If people don't trust the platform, they don't trust Patreon anymore, users are going to decline. Patreon can only lose so many major accounts and campaigns before it folds. And if you've got even a handful of major accounts, again, it's that 80-20 rule or the 90-10 rule, they're going to take their money with them. They're going to take their users with them. It will be a trickle-down effect. Eventually, the person that's only got a couple dozen Patreon backers will probably feel the pinch from these bigger people leaving the platform. So my advice to you is build your own site, or at least find another way to monetize your supporters directly, and cut out the middleman, cut out Patreon, cut out, you know, wherever you can, because I don't think they're going to be around much longer. That is a personal opinion, of course. But again, I'm so disgusted by the situation that I'm not going to be using Patreon anymore. So let me know what you think in the comments. Please comment below and let me know your thoughts regarding Patreon, your thoughts regarding this whole situation. You know, and subscribe to Clownfish TV for more pop culture news, reviews, rants, gaming videos, art videos, and more. This has been Neon. I'll be on with Geeky and with Squid King throughout the week with more content. Go to clownshishtv.com. We're not live yet, but if you put your email address in there, we will send out an email when we're ready to launch the new site. And we've got some really exciting things planned for 2019. We'd like to see you guys there. Okay, bye.